It's been a real privilege and an honor, to be such a young gallery and to have the works of, such masters in the gallery. For me, we stay at the back, and so this is also my living room, and so it's been a great treat from that point of view. The two artists, we wanted to put them together, both for the importance of the contributions that they've made to South African art, but also because in and amongst the political landscape of when they were producing their works and the subject matters that they chose, they always seemed to center the individual, never allowing a political situation or never allowing a circumstance of life to overdetermine what it is that an individual is capable of and what it is that an individual needs to reckon with. It's been a great honor to have this exhibition. It's also a real honor to have such knowledgeable and entertaining and friendly panel who have taken a lot of their time to come through here today. I'm sure Keely, our moderator, will introduce all of them, but to close off, I just want to say thank you to everyone for coming, and thank you very much to our panel for being here. All right, I'll hand over.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thank you all for being here. My name is Keely, and let me just give a brief introduction to our friends here on the panel today. First, we have Sean O'Toole, an art critic and a writer. Like me, we've done a few of these panels together, and I think they keep inviting us, not only because we're very smart and learned, and we love to talk, but because art critics, for whatever reason, seem to have the best gossip. Or at least we're loyal to no one. So we're happy to spill. Our friend Neil Dundas, on the other hand, recently retired as senior curator from Goodman Gallery after 40 years at the business. And we are very excited to hear about some of the stories that he's accumulated over the years, although we do respect the fact that he may or may not be contractually obligated to take some to the grave. Songezo Zantsi is the only professional painter we have on the panel today. So we hope that he can actually explain to us his firsthand experience with some of the techniques and processes that make these works as beautiful as they are. That being said, he has a solo exhibition opening here at Vela next week, so it may be possible that he doesn't want to speak about or think about painting for a long time. So let's go gently on him. And finally, we have Phillipa Duncan, who is an art advisor and a researcher at Vault Research, in addition to the dozens of other hats that she wears, because Phillipa probably has more energy than the rest of the panelists combined. Yeah, thank you all for being here. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Clarke and Hodgins, but for those of you who aren't, let me give a brief introduction and apologies, but I am going to read from my press release. Clarke and Hodgins were contemporaries. Both were born in the 1920s and passed away in the 2010s. While Hodgins was born in England, both artists lived and worked in South Africa for most of their lives. They are known principally for their paintings, but they also served as printmakers, writers, and educators. In the studio, they tended to work slowly and methodically, and yet both were extremely prolific. Bold, sensuous color is the hallmark of both painters' work, and both were passionate observers of the society in which they lived. So I do want to talk about the historical and cultural significance of these artists, but before we get into the details of the legacy, what I want to start with is first impressions. And my question for everyone on the panel is, when did you encounter Clarke and or Hodgins' work for the first time? I think we should probably just go that way.
So I did printmaking at school, and so secondary school. And one of the printmakers that, my then printmaking teacher used as an example was Peter Clarke's work. And I've always loved Clarke's printmaking as his primary medium. Yes, his painting is beautiful, yes, his gouaches are beautiful, but his prints are absolutely exquisite. In terms of actually meeting him, he had a retrospective in 2010 at the National Gallery in Cape Town. Met him then. Then I realised I also had recognised him from numerous exhibition openings over the years, and also then used to take Peter out for cups of tea just to chat. And in fact, it was over one of those sort of cups of tea and slices of carrot cake, which between that and cheesecake were his favourite. We were just sort of chatting, and he was saying, because one of the projects I work with is the legacy and estates of Eric Laubscher and Claude Boucheron, and he said, oh yes, no, he remembers 6 Cheviot Place so well because of the gatherings that used to happen there. And of course, one of the things that used to happen there is the security police were always outside, and every now and again there'd be the ominous knock at the door. And Peter said, there were numerous occasions where he found himself shuffled out the back kitchen door, down into the cellar underneath, and then would sort of listen to the footsteps, overhead until waiting for someone to retrieve him from the depths. So that was really, really it. And I remember being so sad when I heard that he passed away, because in many ways his star was kind of really on that upward trajectory post that big retrospective, and the kind of international recognition that he always should have had with various projects that had happened.
For me, my first encounter with Peter Clarke's work, it's when I was in college studying, majoring in printmaking. I think that's where my love for Peter's work tend to sort of and have that relation. I can agree with Phillipa. The printmaking of the hand of Clarke is the one sort of you can get more attracted to when you're someone that understands the medium, the how he separates each and every area, his sensibility. I think it's around 2015 when I first encountered his work. But for Robert, it's now in this space that I'm hearing this artist, and now I'm honored even to sit around people that created the relationship with these people.
Thanks. Thank you. Hi, everybody. So I met Peter only quite late in his life, and it was when that same retrospective was at the Standard Bank Gallery in Johannesburg. And of course, that title on this book, which was done with Phillipa Hobbs and Liz Rankin, I think, originated in that retrospective. And it was such an extraordinary show. And of course, I'd known some of his work. And like many other people, I think, because of the precision in printmaking, and I'm particularly fond of woodcut, out of which the greater proportion of his graphics is made. And I'd always thought there was a great sensitivity and an understanding of realism and anatomy which allowed him to break the rules very successfully as a printmaker. But he carried that forward into the travels that he made, and what he decided to involve into his own work from other painters in both Africa and Europe. And it's incredible when you look at the places he exhibited in his lifetime, given that very tough beginning, born in Simonstown, ripped out of it as so many South Africans of colour were by forced removal, and ending his life living in Ocean View, which I think, Keely, as you wrote, very sadly, you cannot see the ocean, nor is there any view. One of those parts of Cape Town which came to its life in a kind of misery. But you never sensed any of that in meeting the man. I was astonished by his command and understanding of how movements like Cubism and other 20th century earlier movements had come about, but also what he decided he would keep and what he would discard out of those in his own work. And his paintings, for me, are quite so brilliant because of the kind of print history he'd started with. And it was a pleasure to meet him. But he exhibited in Kenya and Botswana, and he knew about artists like El Hadji C, who ended up at Africa 95 and on Documenta. But there was no envy. There was just a pleasure for things coming out of Africa going elsewhere. And that added to Oslo and Paris and London, made for a pretty amazing career from somebody who didn't seem likely to be able to get there. Robert, I might leave some of that to Sean, only because Robert was one of my closest friends and I miss him dearly to this day. I did once say I never imagined that in my late 20s I would have such an I was about to say old friend when he put his hand up and said, long-lasting old boy, long-lasting, not old. So he was young man and I was old boy. I met Rob when he was teaching at Wits. I learned a lot about his history. I was his liaison at Goodman Gallery from 1984 until his death. I worked closely with his heir, Jan Neertlen, and the estate still, and we had an amazing friendship. But Robert was the best student of human life and human social theatre in particular out of every painter I've ever come across. So you see Kitai, you see Bacon, those influences that came from his years at Goldsmiths, but you also see the evidence of the man who was born into utter penury, who was shoeless by the time he left school, doing a newspaper boy's run at 14 in London, and not being able to go home because his mum was turning tricks. And that was how his life was. He came out of the poorest and most difficult of challenges. And like Peter Clarke, he also managed to escape those entirely on his own merits, on his further studies, on doing exceptional things for a boy who had to leave school before he turned 14 to end up graduating from Goldsmiths was an honour, and end up as senior paintings lecturer at Wits University for years, having been arguably the best art critic in the country for Newscheck for 6.5 years in Pretoria before that. He was astonishing and incredibly accomplished and a real Renaissance man in every way. So I'm very happy to see this concomitance of work between Clarke and Hodgins. Sean.
I'll pick up on Robert. Those of you who sort of know broad sketch of his life, he emigrated a second time and ended up in Pretoria and taught there. If you see photos from that time, there's always a cigarette. It's a great hallmark. It's probably what killed him too.
70 a day.
Yeah, he was a worker. And one of the things he called himself was Johannesburg artist exiled in Pretoria. And let me think. I mean, I suppose the question was firsts. I can't like most people, artists sort of enter your peripheral vision, and at some point they come into focus. The first time that I met Robert was in 2003, where he was doing a couple of months residency on Brick Lane in London, and he was painting there. An art dealer had installed him there, and the idea was to take this South African phenomena who'd been discovered at 80 and reintroduce him to the English market, because he'd studied with Bridget Riley. He was of that generation, and the idea was here's a modernist that we can position. That project entirely didn't work. It was at one or two expat collectors who bought work. But I met Robert on Brick Lane. He too had a dog with him that day, a little wire-haired fox terrier. Peter was not long afterwards, and it was also, I suppose, a dealer attempt to rehabilitate an artist, or in simpler terms, remind people of past greatness. So Michael Stevenson, who considers Peter Clarke a national treasure, has said as much. Put on the exhibition of his sort of late graphic works, those fans. And about a year later, I was still living in Johannesburg at that time. Warren Sieberts brought Peter up and had an exhibition with Valerie Desmore, Albert Adams, Dollar Brand. And I went to the Ritual Artists Dinner, and Peter was the only person of color there. There was a lot of sophisticated Johannesburg yuppies, and he was absolutely silent, seated in the middle of these people that took not a single bit of interest in him. There was a sort of a passing question and then nothing. And it was kind of shocking because I didn't know Peter either. And I just remember the kind of, I don't know, solitariness of this figure seated amongst the sophisticated who are your clients. And I don't mean to be jagged or anything. Let me read something because it's important that people recognize, and I'm glad you said Robert. Robert was a remarkable art critic. Peter had his first exhibition about 2 blocks from here, his first solo show in 57. 2 years earlier, in 1955, he won the drum short story competition. He beat Richard Reeve and famously started corresponding with Langston Hughes. You know, these are, we use the term lightly, Renaissance man, but truly they sort of straddled a lot of different spheres. But let me just read something. This is from Peter's wonderful collection of writing, Plain Furniture. It's published in 1991. I was delighted I picked this copy up. It used to belong to Mavis Orpin, who's a great pal of, or was, of Hilton Nell. It's all these like buried lineages. It's called Times Change. His great Voortrekker grandfather would, instead, have raised his Voorleier higher and shot me dead. His grandfather and father would rather have kicked my black ass out of the way so that they could pass. How nicely, he says, skis toch. Times change. How strange.
Can I keep the microphone? I'll project.
Okay.
Because my next question is for you.
Can I just say,
Oh, yeah.
one thing? You mentioned Langston Hughes and correspondence, and the first few letters that he exchanged with Langston, he actually signed himself Peter Camaro, because he was terrified that as a brown man, someone of Hughes's stature wouldn't respond to him if he knew he was only brown and black. So.
Keely.
Sorry, back to you. No, all good. I was just thinking, was that based off of Sidney Kumalo? I wonder. We don't know.
Yeah,
Okay.
so the name would resonate.
But Sean, I wanted to ask you, because to me you're the king of anecdotes. If you can think of one anecdote for both Robert and Peter that kind of encapsulates them or encapsulates their practice, what would it be?
So when at Robert's wake at Marguerite Stevens, north of Johannesburg, after Neil got up, wept and couldn't say a word, William Kentridge stepped up and delivered the greatest anecdote. So I'll quote William. Probably you remember it. So if you were friends with Robert, if you moved from peripheral vision into his center, he would invite you to his house out at Midrand. And if you were lucky, he would make omelets. And you would graduate from omelets to something greater. Clearly, William did. Of course they did. I mean, they collaborated throughout the 80s and 90s. So Robert fancied himself as a cook and invited William round and made chicken stuffed with ox tongue, which he called tongue-in-cheek. So main course was served, and then there was dessert, and there was a tart, and Robert was going to ladle ice cream on, and William said, "Oh, no thanks," and he said, "It's certainly showing." Peter, this is an indirect anecdote. I was in Johannesburg, and a photographer friend in that very flat Joburg way said, "Hey, Brew, who's Peter Clarke?" So I said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, he had the photographer friend had an exhibition at the AVA gallery, and he'd received a letter from Peter Clarke congratulating him on the show and complimenting him on the work." And I said, "Well, if you speak to Simpiwe Nzube, if you speak to Mwande Zenzile, there's a number of people that Peter had these rich correspondences with. And that was a measure of Peter, going to a stranger's exhibition and corresponding directly with them. Robert did the same. In my youth, I published a collection of short stories, and Robert asked to read it. And then he sent me a fax. And he said, "It's good, it's not great, but keep on."
And Neil, I wanted to ask you, you worked with Robert for so long, and as you say, you were very close. What was it like working together and kind of watching his practice change over time?
So it's an extraordinary privilege actually getting to work with somebody like that over such a long period. I joined the gallery on the 14th of April 1982, so it was 42 years ago this past April. And the person that I worked the most closely with for the longest time was Robert. From about 1984, I had met him at a Wits summer school that I attended, and we kind of became quite friendly in my first year or two, and then your mascot, the mascot of the show loves the story. And because Rob and I got on so well, Linda had said, "You're working with Sydney, do you want to work with Robert as well?" And the most incredible thing about Robert was that life in the studio, because life in the studio was something that he, Robert and Deborah shared so much of through the 80s and 90s when they did a lot of collaborative work, both animated films and graphics together, and even some larger works made on one canvas or one sheet of paper, particularly in the case of Easing the Passing of the Hours, which has been shown also with Charlotte's Kunstkammer, and she and Louis owned works from that. It was an extraordinary thing, and fairly recently I had the chance for our 55th anniversary exhibition, I was able to put on exhibition, having had extensive cleaning work done, the two works which could hang together across almost 5 meters in the back of our Johannesburg gallery, and made in collage, kind of palimpsestic, with paint and ink and other things on 2 canvases, with the kind of stage setting and the characters, the little general in his wheelchair, the purveyor of Pyrrhic victory, and very much born out of that time of civil conflict in South Africa. Although never declared, it was literally a civil war, if you were on the receiving end, as so many South Africans were. So, and it was extraordinary to see them again that many years later. Deborah was already living in New Zealand. Robert was dead. William and I stood and looked at them for a long time, and he said, "Damn, we were good." And they were. It was an excellent relationship between them, and they all had started, in fact, not at Goodman, but with Nadine Gordimer's husband, Reinhold Kassera, who, of course, came to South Africa to set up Sotheby Park Burnett. And Rani's gallery, Kassera Fine Art, was exceptional in its day, smaller than some of the bigger galleries are today, but very well selected. And now that I come to think of it, actually the first time I ever saw Peter Clarke work in painting was in Casera Fine Art. And he encouraged the artists to have a sense of community between themselves. And I found that Robert, of everybody, extended that to the gallery staff and to other artists on a regular basis, as Sam Tlingetwa does today. But we really try to cultivate that in the gallery, that there be a sense of you don't have to belong to a movement, you don't have to put any kind of ism behind your interest in art. But we would like you all, because you work with us, to know one another and maybe understand and respect, even if you don't like each other's works. What I think was exceptional, Robert would also write to people or leave a note or even send a telegram on one occasion to somebody about really thinking their work was great. There was a generosity of spirit, understanding the challenge or tumult that somebody might have gone through to end up putting that finished work on the wall. And Peter Clarke once did write to David Kobani as well, and that is in his papers now, also congratulating him on some of the giant purple-tinged paintings of the Zionist church movement. And working with Robert was an absolute joy. It was a complete and utter pleasure. And he was the kind of person who got to a point he could talk even more than me, which is saying something. But he would command, quiet now, I want to say this in response to what you told me. But as he said to me, argue with Linda like you argue with me, because no one's going to respect you if you won't argue your point. But if you're going to argue with me, you better be able to substantiate it. And his understanding of the chemistry of paint and the chemistry of people were what made that career so very special. Who am I passing on to?
Maybe you can pass it to Songezo, maybe on the subject of chemistry of paint. Songezo, as a painter, when you're looking at these works, are they influencing you in any way? And in general, how do these art historical masters kind of impress upon you and talk to you when you're in the studio, in your process?
With this exhibition, setting up these last 3 months ever since the art fair, I was locked in the studio trying to create the solo that is going to be opening next week. And I only had an opportunity to go around this room and absorb this energy from this historical era. On answering your question, how these pictures that I made here sort of like influence my own practice, I get the sense of community from Clarke, because also me as a creator, I've shared some sort of like understanding with Nzube when I started painting, and Nzube sort of like helped me to reach where I'm at the moment. So I've understood the hand that he received from Uncle Clarke. And with that, in terms of approach, technique, for me, printmaking, some of the people will know me as an old painter, but I have some prints that I've done in my college years, and balancing the painting and printmaking, I feel like I'm also traveling the path of Clarke, My work deals a lot with social realism, community, culture, and I feel also with the technique that Robert is using, you can easily find it in my work, in terms of that expressionism, in terms of, you can see those Bacon type influences there, And even me, I was talking to Neil that I'm reading Siket, I'm reading these type of influences in my work. This exhibition, I can say anyone that looks in my practice can see some of the of the pictures that are depicted here, I touch also all those narratives that these artists have touched on. But now I couldn't say that they fully influence my work, but they're not that apart from what I'm doing, and I can easily absorb that. Yeah.
Maybe on the subject of printmaking, Phillipa, I know at one point you were working on a publication about Peter Clarke's prints. Bless you. And I wanted to, you've touched on it a little bit, but I wanted to know, what is it about his printmaking that is so special and speaks to you?
So firstly, I mean, I'd ask everyone to, now I've got a stick in my ring. There's a work there called Skipping Rope, and the back of it speaks so beautifully to Peter's practice, because it has the wonderful burnished quality that you get on a reductive woodblock print when you are hand printing it, using a spoon or some sort of, hard object to lift that, to lift the pigment off the plate. And, for me, that's what makes Peter's work so special, is that he created this incredible body of work primarily in his very petite ocean view home. It's one of those tiny little up and down houses, and downstairs was, his kitchen, living room, and that's where he worked. That's where he produced some of the best printmaking that I think we can say that we have access to in terms of the 20th century. And it was at that little kitchen table that he worked. I mean, yes, he then also, he did projects with Caversham, he did projects with Cap, all of which then allowed him to work on different scales, larger scales, also introducing, lithography into his process, etching into his process, all of which would have required very different, materials for him to access. But it was being able to take a reduction print and, speak to his community, speak to every person that he saw and he witnessed. And I think that's what Peter really was, is he was a people watcher. I mean, in that quietness that he always had in social situations, he was always watching. He was an incredible observer. And it was that incredible empathy that he felt for his fellow community that he brought into his work. And I was just reading a couple of things this past week just to kind of brush up on Clarke, so to speak. But and I came across a piece of writing, and it was levelled as a kind of an entry point into the 2010 retrospective. But it was highly critical of the fact that he hadn't been involved, for example, in the Tupelo workshop, which Tupelo was very much a space that encouraged community, again, amongst artists. But there he was criticised for it because, he started then from those workshops working with collage within his work. It was held as a criticism. Then the criticism was the fact that, if he'd had a larger studio and done larger works and, imagine what he could have done. And I think that in itself completely fails to recognise the importance and the power of Peter Clarke, the deliberate choice and scale that he chose, with his works. And, I think that's often a problem with art criticism is, if you come from a very strongly academic point of view, when using that art critical lens, you actually lose the person, you lose the community, you lose the subject. And at the end of the day, I mean, Peter was, he was a son, he was a brother, he was an uncle, and he was a very dedicated member of his community. I mean, in the sort of early 2010s, he got involved in Ocean View in kind of like a public art project. So encouraging the youth of Ocean View and the surrounds to come and, paint large-scale murals within the community. And it gave a youth a sense of purpose and a sense of opportunity that they'd never experienced before. And Peter was just so unbelievably generous with his time and his energy, and he would always be happy to share. He would, he always wanted to engage, and I think that's really where he becomes so important. And just taking those tiny little everyday moments that most of us, for example, won't even pay the proper amount of consideration to, and putting them into, making them an image, making them the primary subject, every single piece is then elevated onto a wall where someone can sit up and take notice of it. And that's really, to me, what continues to resonate in his work. That and his utterly gorgeous handwriting. I mean, face it, nothing beats, Peter's handwriting.
Thank you. Yeah, I love your description of the house where Peter Clarke worked, because I think an artist studio says so much about them as a person and the work that they make as a result. So maybe to ask the others who have been to Peter Clarke's home or Robert Hodgins' studio or studios over the years, what are some of the memories that come to mind?
Okay. Yeah, talking here with Jonathan earlier this week, I just want to refer back to something you said, Songezo, because I think what struck me immediately was that you may have trained in printing and then become more and more a self-taught, damn good painter, I have to say. For those of you who don't know his work, don't miss this show that's coming. I can't be here at the opening, but when I come back to Cape Town, I will see it. But I recognized immediately the impact of certain other and unsuspected, from my point of view, painters that you were looking at. And Sickert was the standout. So it is extraordinary. But I think perhaps all artists who really have this instinct for absorbing and processing and then putting back into a pictorial form, not just trying to represent something in some realistic way, but rather, Robert spoke about paintings being not just making an image someone could recognize, but rather that the image was about, and he said, correct me if I'm wrong, content and subject matter are not the same thing. Your subject matter might be the 99th image of a child. Same old, same old. Your content is about what you're saying about that child and what you really make somebody understand and empathize with in its particular context. And that thing of subject matter and content not being the same is something that has resonated with me for now 40-odd years. And that studio, was a good South African word, a pondoki, really. Quite large, because it kept getting added onto with a bit more concrete screed and another pole and a bit of tinted roofing and eventually plastic lining and some insulation, but never proper walls and things. Many easels and tables and old broken chairs and extraordinary. Whereas Young had a studio inside the house on the property, and it's a small holding and of chaotic nature in truth. But it also made me think of Robert was never content with just having one layer of meaning or content, or even in pointing you in a certain guideline with his captions, many of which are hugely witty and very learned. But it was the same as his cooking. So the favourite, of course, was turducken. And turducken was a turkey stuffed with a duck, stuffed in turn with a chicken, stuffed in turn sometimes with a quail. And he semi-deboned, but you still found the bones as you went along. And then he would say, come along, old boy, but you can wield the electric knife. Cut. And it was something else. But turducken to quite loud operatic music on a Sunday afternoon while Robert held forth on painting was extraordinary. And then you'd go to the studio, because that, as he said, had to be something separate. It was the other life. And that other life is, I think, it's what everybody occupies when they really are in the process of developing their own visual vernacular. And that was the thing for Peter Clarke. And it struck me so strongly with what Jonathan has got on this exhibition, because there are no really large works, the largest being the Bathers at Sandy Bay, which I recognized instantly, but it is so much more beautiful in person and in context. But these prints and that tiny little painting behind Phillipa. You know, if you look at that online, you imagine that those figures are monumental. It's a bit like Hodgins and Battis could do that sometimes too. You would go to an exhibition looking for this vast picture and you would find it was that big and be shocked. It is a great thing to do as Peter did. He allowed the viewer to understand his circumstances. Foolish criticism to talk about him not adapting to bigger scale and working more expressively. That speaks of its time in a bad way. But Tupelo encouraged a great sense of community and experimentation, and you see it coming into his work afterward, but it's still on that scale. As his limitations forced themselves upon him, so he adapted and made some of his most brilliant work in postcard size. But I can tell you, you can make a selection and send them to somebody who's never heard of Peter Clarke, and they will imagine that every single one of them is 50 by 75 centimeters, or a meter by a meter and a half. And that ability to literally put into a picture the sense of scale and depth of a Cape landscape. Look at Boonsayer influence in that painting, but those boys relate to the bathers on Sandy Bay, and they relate much more to Botero or to Diego Rivera, or something cultivated around the way the post-impressionist gaze looked at people of colour, largely in the great, pardon the inverted commas, Western canon. But that for me, it's those impressions of conveying something that really shows that couple in the theatre, and it is a theatre portrait, and he made many paintings like that, Robert. You know, her fan kind of somewhat interrupts her lopsided bosom. They are a turn-of-the-century couple, but they belong in the last century more than in the rather brightly lit theatre, typical of Hodgins, as you mentioned. And yes, there is one of the paintings coming which I delight in seeing something absolutely Hodgins-esque, but in your own way, which is a great thing. I love the fact artists absorb by osmosis. Reuse it in your own way, and that's even better. But that picture is so typical of so many others. They're quite not in accord with one another. The picture that you would know, Sean, off to the charity ball, where he's standing in the side of the room looking like he's about to be further henpecked, and she has an accusatory, as Robert said, little hand pointing at him. And as he said, the first time we exhibited it, yes, they're off to the charity ball, but you can tell it's not going to be a pleasant evening, old boy. And those are the things that, and everybody, when Robert told that anecdote, people would laugh exactly as you've done, because everybody could see it. So in fairly limited strokes of paint, as he does there, but certainly the atmosphere of that one boy is looking straight out of the Clarke painting, straight at you, the viewer. But it's the defiance of, sure, we know we're doing a dangerous thing. We're boys being boys. We're climbing a tree that's growing on the edge of a rock. And of course we could fall, but hey, we're invincible. That's how it is. And he understood that community and his need to connect to that community. And the generosity is of how many people were allowed into those studios, were encouraged to come in. Robert did workshops for students every year. And I have people 30 years later who come back to say, we saw you've got another Hodgins, and can we look? And they can all tell you stories, sitting in student groups around on the floor of the gallery. And certain schools, the Hope School, Waterford from Swaziland, would come by bus. From the Free State, they'd come by bus to come and meet Robert in his shows. He and Clarke have that in common as well. They wanted the people that they looked at and observed and painted about to understand and love their work.
Did you have something?
No, just picking up on that, the notion of an artist being able to distill the information they see, and back to the scale of Clarke's work. And it was really those Mexican murals, of Rivera and like that, influenced Peter. But he didn't want to create on that scale. He wanted to turn it on its ear and, make it as powerful as Gold with a Pearl Earring, which is also this tiny little thing that hangs on a wall, but damn, she can dominate. I mean, the same as for every single Peter Clarke work, is it doesn't need to be a large production. Its intimacy is what actually makes it so powerful.
I'm going to head elsewhere in answering your question. There's a well-known artist who, I suppose his mantra, which will be on his grave, is the studio is a safe space to fail. I once asked this famous artist, who is his model of an artist? So William Kentridge said Robert Hodgins, because he believed fundamentally in the studio. Talking came second. And it taught him that you can go into the studio, muck around, fail. So if we jump to Peter Clarke, I was looking at photos that I took when I visited him, and I think in some senses the studio is a fact, but it's also an imaginative space, not only for the artist, but for outsiders. We fetishize or fantasize the artist's studio, but it's generally quite a prosaic space. It just has tools for making. But it also has often feral objects. So Peter Clarke has a particular grammar. I looked at a photo, and this thing was definitely not Peter Clarke. He balanced it on a chair, fairly large work, and it was a kind of assemblage work, monochrome. It was entirely silver, with things sort of pasted together. And it's like, what the F? But it reminded me of a work by Robert Hodgins from the early 60s. Because one thing we haven't said, Robert's life was lived in 2 acts as an artist. He started exhibiting in the 50s, showed at a couple of prominent galleries, and called it a day in 62, and became a writer. And then only when he left Wits in the 80s, in the mid-80s, did he sort of commit himself to being a kind of full-time or professional artist again. It's roughly correct, right? Roughly.
Well, you have to say, Robert, in one year at the National Festival of the Arts, they said there's no young artists this year, and everybody said, why? And they said, because our committee voted to give it to Robert Hodgins, who was 68 at the time, and they all were white. So he was just called the special guest artist that year. And it's a fine exhibition with a catalogue by Liz Rankin and Alan Crump.
It's a very valuable catalogue.
Very valuable. It's a little pamphlet, really, but it cost the earth because it's been out of print for decades. But then, of course, he joined Riley from 1980, and then 84 moved to Goodman, and we
moved or got poached?
No. Reinhold, Riley was closing down, of course, because he wasn't well. And we were desperate to poach him, make no mistake. But in fact, Reinhold was kind enough. He actually said, Mrs. Goodman, you may bring Neil, but you have to come to lunch because you want to talk about William Kentridge, because I'm closing down, and William said we should talk. So we only dealt with William's prints up to that point. And we went to the lunch, and there were Robert, Deborah, Sam and Tlingitwa, David Kowani, and William. And the deal was, you take one, you take them all. And we were delighted, so it was a very nice inheritance. But from that point, Robert had really started painting a lot again, even before he retired. So although the essay in the big retrospective was done with Art Club Festival in 2000, and we published that book with Tafelberg then, and that toured the country, and was a really big show of Act 1 and then by that stage Act 2, and that was already in 2005. But he had, by that stage, had 7 solo exhibitions with Goodman, 2 in Cape Town and 2 in London with Simon Mee Fine Art. Only one of which was really successful. As you pointed out, the British audience wasn't quite ready for him yet. But once he dedicated himself, then of course he became so much more prolific.
This might be impolite, but let's go there. You can't defame the dead. Robert Hodgins had a love affair with a student, Mark Hipper, and was very passionate, and a lot of letters were exchanged. Here's Robert. And the reason I read this is we have a good publishing culture devoted to artists in this country. We have an appalling tradition of artists' biographies. You never really get to understand an artist in full. They're so exceptional, those books. Like if you think of Chabani Manganyi's book on Sokoto, it's one of the few biographies. They're very distinct from the books that dealers bring out, because dealers have to shift product, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm talking of the literary tradition of the biography, where you understand the complexity of both the individual in relation to their professional life. Here's Robert writing to Mark in Berlin. An exhibition of my new works opens at Witz in May. This is 1986. It is joined by a collection of paintings of work going back to 1953, which will go to the Grahamstown Festival. 110 works. Interestingly, and spooky, it opens on my 66th birthday and shows 33 years of work, exactly half a lifetime. The show then goes all over, to Cape Town, PE, Durban, Pietermaritzburg, Bloemfontein, Joburg, Pretoria, even Kimberley. By next year, this time, I'll be the most famous, and then in brackets, more likely the most detested painter in South Africa. But of course, only in South Africa. No real big deal. Fortunately, not important, for I still love the making, almost erotically, certainly physically, definitely mentally. So beautiful. So beautiful. I think, the reason that I bring it up is really not to defame anyone. It's part of, and I think it's if one's trying to make associations with Robert and Peter, there is the biographical fact that they were gay men and to a degree lived closeted lifestyles. But they lived in 20th century South Africa where being a gay man was criminal. Look at the work by Peter at Sandy Bay. I mean, I always find his beach scenes extraordinary, partly because it's a bit like the portrait that Jonathan's printed of Peter with the bell, taken by George Hallett. It was taken, I think, in France, and it's actually a diptych. It gets paired with a photo of wet leaves. It's extraordinary work. Comes out of like a very intimate relationship with George Hallett. When I say intimate, they were pals. And there's something about that side of, I think, particularly Peter, that I find interesting. Finding a kind of provisional paradise in what is a hell, South Africa. And works like that, where there's so much about desire, looking, not declaring, but very obviously stating. I mean, there's that fabulous print with the man with the erection about to enter another one, which is just like, okay, this is not ambiguous.
Yeah, I think that is really interesting. Sorry, and I'm going to just interject there, because we sold in London in September possibly the last big show that I will curate for Goodman Gallery specifically. And it was a work looking at a lot of the, well, various people wanted to call it modern masters or masters of modernism in South Africa. And there was an ism, but it wasn't modernism as the Tate Dictionary might describe it. But there were many artists, and Robert and Peter both came to that with the African influences, the influences of the politics of their day in South Africa, but where they looked at the way modern art had gone through a certain period. At one point, Robert said, I hope to end my life not using any of the isms particularly, but just a Cole Porter song. At this period, anything goes. And I think by then he had dared to make the work of the Ballet Russe, where he said, well, of course, by that stage, old boy in Paris, Diaghilev wasn't a handsome boy. He was a wrapped sausage. And he was making Nijinsky's life miserable by aiding and abetting, putting him in an asylum. And he was outraged by some of those anecdotes about the gay popular legends of the time and the way they were treated. And Peter Clarke, I think also, there are declaratory paintings, which I do think the Bathers at Sandy Bay, it's absolutely undeniably homoerotic. And I liked very much what you and Jonathan had put in the pamphlet, that you sense that the one boy is rather kind of concerned about his nakedness, but kind of rather also wanting to be part of the naked group. I can remember knowing what that felt at Sandy Bay. So it is a good point, and it's very much something that, of course, certainly in the minds of both artists as they went along. And neither of them was afraid of homoeroticism by a certain period in their lives, but it's certainly that coming out took longer than developing originally their own visual vernacular and style, for the obvious reasons. But it also was the kind of thing that socially gave them a voice of righteous anger about a lot of things in the old apartheid South Africa.
I might want to open it up to questions from the audience, if there's any. And if in emergency, I have a few more. But please don't be shy. Jonathan.
I have one for Neil as a gallerist. Having worked with Robert over such an extended period of time, I'm curious to know how you put exhibitions together. Would you just create works in the studio and then you'd come in and pick those works, or would you work specifically towards different exhibitions with different themes? And then I have a question for Sean after that. Sean, as a writer, how did you relate or respond to Robert's writings as a critic, and then also as a fiction writer yourself? Peter's stories, his essays, and his poetries. Where do you sort of find them to be the most successful?
Just briefly, they're related to that painting. There's a beautiful poem by Peter Clarke, if you don't know it, called Beachcombers. And it's very much that observer that is in that. To answer your question, Jonathan, I mean, probably my friendships that really evolved with Deborah, Robert and William together, because we would all go to each of the studios at that stage. And so I've been able to be more frequently a studio visitor than with a lot of the other artists that Goodman has dealt with, some of whom you make an appointment and you got a certain length of time and then leave me alone because this is my domain and I'm working. With Robert, we could talk a lot about the work, and I was on that property with him and Jan and his sister, Jan's sister Lois, far more often than I was in anyone else's studio, because we really became very close friends. And Robert and I could talk about, for obvious reasons, all sorts of subjects. And because in the later career, certainly from the middle 80s onward, he became so much more prolific, so there was always work to select from. He would have an idea of how he wanted to couch that particular show, and I've always believed the artist is the generator of the work. And unlike some gallerists who shall remain nameless, I have never been inclined to say, I don't like that, or I think this is the best, or let the artist couch what they really want and believe they're showing what they feel might be best. They may not always be their own best critic, but you can argue that at a later point. But bring the work in, and then as you hang, let it evolve. And Robert was good. He became a better critic of his own work once you were hanging. Sometimes, sadly, only the day before the opening, when you'd find yourself re-hanging quite a lot, but mostly knowing that he was right. and that he had insisted on a couple of things, one of which he once said, "Well, fuck me, that's just unfinished. You should have said unfinished right from the start." So pardon the language, but he would say that kind of thing. So I do believe it's an evolutionary thing. I think and I think very much listening to you talk about Songezo's works and looking at how you've moved from one very particular painterly style to now going more for Clarke's style, taking something powerfully atmospheric in a small space, which is a very different challenge. But I have to say, and we spoke a bit about that on Wednesday, you really see an evolution, and I think hats off to both of you for being in conversation around this and working towards a show that is going to be very different from what you've shown before, but equally which really shows very different and progressive steps. And I suppose that's the best one can hope for as a gallerist, is to have enough of a bond, but the honesty of being the artist and the gallerist, expressing your doubts sometimes, or very gingerly daring to criticize and open up an argument that you might regret later, but it can be necessary. It is not an easy thing, but the School of Diplomacy demands it.
You should have just sat here and just spoke. We could listen. I think it's no great secret. We've come to the end of a particular chapter in journalistic art criticism, and I think globally, but it's very clear in South Africa, for various reasons. Fucking Facebook, and it's not just that, but I think if one's interested in the idea of commentary on art, you can look to various sources, and if you look historically, there are formal art critics, of which Esme Berman would be an example. Yet there's a tradition where artists have written their own art criticism for various reasons, partly, mainly, chiefly, to earn a bit of cash when you're poor and you're young, to survive. But if you look more sympathetically, there's like a kind of family lineage that goes even before Walter Battis. Walter Battis, Robert Hodgins becomes an acolyte, becomes a print assistant to Walter Battis. Walter Battis often complained that he couldn't get onto shows because people thought he was essentially an archaeologist. And it was only after his 50s that people started regarding his paintings. One of Robert Hodgins' most important students is Ivor Powell. Ivor's interest in Ubu comes directly from Robert Hodgins, and taking that idea for a walk. I think Ivor, despite his many detours, was one of the most important art critics of the last sort of 30, 40 years. And that's directly attributable to Robert. And they remained friends. I remember just shortly before Robert died, we chatted, and he said, well, Ivor phoned him, of course drunk, speeding on the highway. And he's like, dear boy, he thinks he's 25. He's a 60-year-old man. Okay, so, that's all cheap anecdote. But the point is, Robert understood the importance of the word in relation to image. The one was not an accessory to the other. And even when you go look at Robert's art criticism, it's quite extraordinary, like some of the art check stuff. He wrote very appreciatively. I was hugely surprised of Alexis Preller. I don't personally like Alexis Preller. Interestingly, he didn't like Christo Kutsia. He said those were kind of tricks that you could pull in Elberton. And he had a sense of humor which was vital, and there was the traffic of that humor between his writing and his work. So in the 70s, a much diminished Clement Greenberg was sort of shipped off to South Africa to judge an art award. And as part of the compact, he had to deliver public lectures. And he gave a lecture at the University of, or at Wits, and then at what is UJ, back then Rao. And Robert reviewed them. And his review is pretty withering. I mean, the sort of summary is he had nothing to say. That opinion translates into a portrait, a profile portrait he made of Clement Greenberg. It's an extraordinary portrait. You could call it anti-Semitic. It's in profile, huge, proboscis. It's a marvelous painting. He also made one, interestingly enough, of Linda Givon. And when he gifted it to her, she returned it on the same day. Peter, I think, Peter as a writer is hugely important. It's undersold. It's not only the fact that he won in his early years a short story competition. In 1975, he went to Iowa to the Writers' Workshop, which in terms of, if the U.S. literary institution, Iowa Workshop is a big deal. He filled in for Credo Mutwe, who couldn't go. But Peter's writing's extraordinary. It sits adjacent to his paintings, and there's a plainness about it that is extraordinary, an ability to just see things as they are, describe them in plain language, and yet through acknowledging the ordinariness, somehow wrest a beauty. I mean, it's slightly, I suppose, adjacent this, but maybe someone would ask, is there like a consistency in one's writing that if you looked at all of it, shows that there is a sensibility that is traveling through there, rather than just writing like a pinball where you're just jumping around and it's just a chaos of responses to different prompts. I don't know, Keely could answer this. I think, maybe there's still the cliche. I've held writing workshops for focused on art writing, and often I often begin by asking, let's create a caricature of an art critic. Just describe them. What do they look like? And invariably they're middle-aged, white, and balding. And there's a certain sort of cliche that attaches to it, which I'll accept, but I think the problem is that is partly a construction, comes out of history certainly, but it ignores the possibility that writing offers to anyone. And that's why I emphasized Robert as a writer. I think artists firstly must seize the right to be able to comment on their work, and then secondly recognize the value of that, and it often has enormous value. Particularly when you look at artists who are no longer around and can't speak for their work, and you go dig in the archive, it's kind of remarkable how silent they are. People speak around them, but not to them.
But I think that's the primary problem, is that we've lost the first-person voice in any commentary on an artist's life or their work. And I think that's what all of us are hopefully going to do in the future, is to actually put that first-person voice back, and to actually, particularly with contemporary artists, is make sure that when they are quoted, that they are quoted correctly. I mean, it's something I've worked to within my own writing, and the projects that I'm looking to do in the future, is to bring that first person voice back and to refer directly to their communications, to their interviews, to what they themselves said, and bring it back into that. And I think that's why my project on Clarke's prints stalled, because I realized you couldn't just have this, this publication as an island. You had to bring more of Peter in, and that's bringing in his poetry and his writing and his comments on himself, and making sure that they read alongside each other.
Look, I could argue against myself and say the immediate crisis is, I'd said earlier that art criticism of a type has come to an end, and that's partly because of a kind of broadening of media, or a horizontalization. Essentially, everyone has access to being communicators. So if you go on Instagram and look, just as an exercise, go look at art critics and their followers, and go look at artists and their followers. It's a huge difference, and that capacity to broadcast directly is great. The problem is when you begin to kind of confuse a following for your own greatness and not hearing any feedback or pushback against your work. I mean, I had to profile an artist, and I said, well, he's looking at Michael Borromans, but maybe sympathetically, if you cover someone, if you do your own Seven Nation Army, one day you will write your own great tune. He was outraged, and I couldn't understand it. Then I looked at his Instagram, and all he was getting was heart emojis the whole time. So criticism it's collegial, it's conversational, and it's just saying, I don't think that works that great in relation to what you're trying. I guess there's other cliches that attach around it, but if you see it as a conversation, and also the right to push back a bit, because if everyone's broadcasting and no one's commenting back, well, I don't know, we're going to get into difficult place, which we are, planetary-wise.
And the anything goes syndrome. I've got a question for Songezo, actually. I think now another show coming up, but in terms of, I think Keely is writing, I'm sure you interact. Do you feel free to be verbal enough to argue against a well-known critic, your well-known gallerist, and make the point that sometimes your opinions may not be their opinions? It should actually be expected that many artists, of course, they use the visual language as a replacement for words, but it doesn't always have to be that way. And I think I have come across times where the artist will only tell you after the exhibition has been mounted, captioned, titled, and written about, that actually they disagreed with some of what was being done, either by the gallery or their critic or their own profile writer. So how do you feel about that, and do you think the chances are now anything goes as well?
That currently is a never-ending obstacle. Even now, I'm still... Yesterday I was here in the gallery trying to conclude my exhibition statement. It's difficult, especially when you are a Xhosa person and you have to translate the exhibition text, and you have to not be misunderstood or misquoted and stuff like that. I don't know. I wish, because I've partaken in workshops and how to write better, but I think visually that's where my language lies. But I think it's something now, as it generally is changing, and especially more exhibitions. Some of them are titled in native languages, and then are translated. I feel like also that gap now is tending to be sort of like met in a good way. Yeah, but I would love to see more of the honor of what you were saying, that also the galleries must fully respect the artist's idea of what this exhibit is going to be about, but I think moving forward I will try and write more about the work, or get the work understood better in writing. But there are some changes in that form.
With the last bit of time that we have, I was hoping that maybe we could read one more poem from Peter Clarke, and then if anybody has any further questions, I'm sure all of our panelists will be around to answer them in a private capacity.
So what's wonderful about Peter, which I mentioned earlier, is his first solo show being on Corporation Street, just down the road. This is called A Moment in Time. You'll probably very quickly get where it's set. A moment in time, in the muggy atmosphere of the hothouse in the municipal gardens in town. The overwhelmingly humid air, like a damp blanket, and there on the ground, a leaf from some exotic tropical plant, just fallen, as if tired. Holding it up to the sunlight, one marveled at its color structure, a network of veins in a leaf of red, vibrant red, the red of fire and rubies and blood. And further, a dry, hard leaf of browns and ochres, bringing to mind the covers of leather-bound volumes of old stories. And another leaf, green, reminding of the freshness of the grain country, in the grain country of spring, with the first wheat blades shooting up from the damp, dark earth. Look at that work at the end. A memory from last summer. A drunk man, oblivious to the day, part of his brown buttocks exposed, lying face down on a pavement in the heat of the sun. The curve of the buttocks was the same beautiful, poetic curve of peaches and the moon.